Rob Thompson here. I'm actually a pilot. Not a lot of manned guys in drones, which I find really odd. In the beginning days, 1998, they came out with a report that said basically they were going to replace airline pilots with automated systems, and that they could get, if they took out the 30 or so passenger seats, took out the equipment, they could add 30 more passenger seats up front. It's a lot of equipment for a guy to fly that. So that's the initial anti-fervent to staying away from using drones and stuff in aviation. And I'm going to do this a little differently. I'm here to help everyone. I'm not pushing a product. I'm pushing my influence. That's basically what I'm selling. My family here, let's see if this laser pointer works. There we go. That's my grandfather, my grandma, that's my dad, my uncle. You see the airplane in the back. My grandfather was understudy of Secretary of Defense, and he made it through 6 administrations as an appointee, which is unheard of today. You won't find someone in the government that's been working the same post for 30 years like that. Right here is not by blood, but I call him my great uncle. That's Scott Crossfield, first man to fly Mach 3. This is at our local airport there, and there's my grandfather, and there's my uncle. My uncle was one of the first SEALs in Vietnam, and also rode on helicopters and got shot at. This is my father working on my other great uncle's T6, and that's from the New Zealand Air Force. There's my grandma. I just recently found out she was one of the first 13 female licensed rotorcraft pilots in the world, and part of a distinguished group called the Whirly Girls. And then there's John Glenn and my grandfather. This photo is from right before John Glenn went into space. My grandfather gave him his check ride. They had to find someone older than John Glenn to check him out, to keep his license going. They called up my granddad. We went down to the airport. It was a good time. These are some of my mentors, and I want to talk about this book I found in my grandfather's collection. He's since passed. My grandmother turns 100 next month, and we're going to have a big party for her and have all these pilots in. But this book here is called the Putt Putt Air Force, and this was a war initiative that started in 1939 through 1944, and this is the story of the civilian pilot training program, which I found very fascinating. The first page here talks about this guy, Commander Hickney, and he's here with Orville Wright. This is back in the 40s, and what they needed to do was they needed a war effort in which it elevated our country, and they trained. It says here in the book, 435,000 trainees, and they didn't have any facilities. They used existing infrastructure. They used existing budgets. It wasn't anything special, but somehow we made it through. My grandmother was a little upset because when the war kicked off, they actually didn't allow any more female pilots. So she had gotten her license and everything, but she wasn't allowed to continue on. She was called up, as it says in this book I learned. I'm flipping through the book, and then what do you know? Grandma's in the book. Didn't even know that. And it says here, she learned to fly in Ohio in 1941, and she received a telegram to report for the WASPs. And it says here that she'd already been committed to my grandfather, and needless to say, my future husband, a pilot himself, an aeronautical engineer, took a dim view of the affair because this is in the 40s and such. And she says her big commitment to aviation was that she stayed home and watched my dad, my uncle, and my grandfather went off to. He has a record for the FAA. He trained with a check ride 14,000 pilots. If you do the math, that's 2 a day for 22 years. I think his logbook has 55,000 hours, and another guy told me that he probably had 90,000 hours of riding, not at the controls, but in an aircraft. That's years and years and years riding in an airplane. Some of my mentors here, this first guy, Weldon Britton, he was the FSDO operator for the Flight Standards District Office in Washington, D.C. from 1970 until 1995 when he retired. He was also commander of the 1st Special Forces Aviation Division. This is Carl Stoltzfus. He owns the world's largest fleet of King Airs. He owns 175 King Airs, and he flies them all through the really bad places as a civilian. And there's a NATO law that says if you get shot at as a civilian and you have the communication channels, you can call in an airstrike. So an airstrike for someone who's in service takes about 7 to 9 minutes. he can call an airstrike in and kill the bad guys in 2-3 minutes. So they ride through in civilian aircraft and get shot at and collect data and do all kinds of very dangerous activities. This next guy here, Don Egan, even though I didn't get much interaction with him, him and my grandfather started all the nav equipment that we're using currently in general aviation today. And that includes all the instrument procedures. This guy was the first guy to ever take off in a jet from an aircraft carrier, and also the first guy to take off at night. And so, in the jet era, that was extremely dangerous because you're taking off a lot faster in prop planes. Velda Ben, good friends of my grandma, she was a WASP. She trained with my grandfather. She had something like 55,000 hours, and she had, I think, 10,000 check rides. That's a lot of training. And then Paul Garber. The reason we have the Air and Space Museums is because of Paul Garber. He had the very first vintage aircraft collection. There was all these planes that were rotting over in D.C., and he decided to put them inside some warehouses and put together the whole museum. These were the people I was bouncing upon their laps and stuff, sitting around a hangar and chewing the fat. Okay, so people may not know this guy, but right here, Hans Weichel. He's the father of Huey, Cobra Gunship, and Jet Ranger. There's my grandfather, and there's Mr. Weichel. My grandmother made this. This is long before Instagram or any computer graphics and stuff. And this tells a story from Bell Helicopter Factory in Fort Worth. They flew down in 2 days to Washington, D.C. Why did they do this? My grandfather, for 5 years, pushed using helicopters, much like we're pushing drones today. The military said, we're not interested in those. You find that's kind of funny today, right? They said it wasn't long range enough. So he flew down with Weichel. You notice my granddad's piloting it, not the father of the Huey. And they flew down and flew it up, landed right on the White House lawn. And they said, here we are. We flew from Texas. Tell us these things aren't long range enough. And now I'm going to strike on a conversation that hits home to you guys here. This is Stanley Hillard. There's my grandfather. There's the helicopter Hillard gave to my grandfather. My grandfather flew that around D.C. for 5 years trying to get people interested in helicopters. He'd take them for a ride. He'd show them what they would do. They just weren't interested. And it seems funny today. So a lesson for Silicon Valley is Hillard, at the age of 15, he designed the first successful coaxial helicopter. 15 years old. At 17, he came up and got a contract with my grandfather, the XH-44 Hillard helicopter, to the U.S. Army. And that's when my grandfather, said, we got to have these things. And it was at the end of World War II, and he didn't have to go to World War II because they felt, he was too smart to, risk being shot up by some folks. And then I asked, what's Silicon Valley doing now? Apps? Facebook, Uber? I mean, what's that going to do for our country? Anything? If anything, it's stirred up a lot of trouble. And you can see here, when they were putting together groups, that Hillard was here in Berkeley from 1930 to 1950 on Addison Street. I don't know where that is, but lots of other things came here. My uncle was involved in the 80s during the Silicon Valley uprising and stuff, and he was plant manager. I forget the company, but there was 13 clean rooms or something like that. You guys may know the company, but then the Chinese came, and that's the end of that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. I've talked a lot about my family. I got over 1,000 hours of commercial operations. I've repaired and inspected over hundreds of aircraft for maintenance. I worked for Zodiac Aerospace, which is a European aerospace company, and I've certified equipment for Airbus, Boeing, Embraer, and Cessna. This is equipment that's installed from the FAA, so it's not only that I can, fly stuff, I also certify equipment. I've flown over 75 different aircraft. I dare you to find somebody that's flown that many different types of airplanes, from DC-3, Waco, T-6, Cub, Beech, Cessna, Piper. I've flown all those aircraft. And then I started to get my feet wet with the FAA, and I came up with a program here called RIAS, which is the Runway Incursion Avoidance System. There was a big problem with, you get out on the end of the runway, and the tower says, hey, it's great to take off, and guess what? There's an airplane coming in, and the guy had to divert, or the guy on the ground took off, and he had a near miss. I mean, that's pretty dangerous, right? So what did I come up with? I said, well, we need a traffic light, and I used an infrared camera to look out at the traffic. And this is in 2006, before we had a lot of facial recognition stuff. And we hand programmed the thing to be able to look at a video and say that's an aircraft. And the infrared stuff worked really good. You could see an aircraft 20, 30 miles away. So I took the program down to the FAA, who currently had a next-gen system they were speaking about. I sat down at the table with the guys at an expo, heads of the program, told them about my thing. They wanted to know, which defense contractor are you working for? Where's your PhD? All this, just trash. And I said, I've got a system here, it works. Well, we've got a system too. And I said, well, tell me about your system. They said, we've got lights in the runway, and you're going to follow these beams, and we're going to put up a heads-up display. And I said, tell me about these lights in the runway, because if anyone knows about paving, runways are fairly thick, fairly expensive to maintain. That's the most expensive part of an airport to maintain. And they said, we're going to put lights in the runway. Great. Of the 13 major airports in America, 9 of them have snow. What's going to happen when the snow comes? You're going to rip the lights out? They're going to be compacted when we need the system the most. And they didn't like that, and they canceled the program 2 months later. That's when I knew I was effective. Here was a kid. I didn't have any degrees at that point, but I made them cancel the program. Next up, I did a pilot communication study. My friend was killed. A helicopter ran into him during a flight training, and I wanted to know, how far away do pilots start speaking to the airport? And I found out there's no set law out there. It's just recommendations. And so I set out to make better recommendations, and I changed communication procedures. Next was avionics design. The iPad revolutionized modern aircraft. So the FAA didn't want an iPad inside of an airplane. And they said, this is a bad idea. We need double redundant systems. You can't change batteries out. What are we to do? And what it really was, I found out, was that the iPad was way more accurate than $500,000 airline systems that we had in 2010. And they said, how can we allow something like this that's going to replace everything? And they were just really scared and hesitant to move forward. Now it's standard procedures. You go grab your iPad and you hit it. It used to be in the old days, you drag around, you see all the pilots drag around the jet plates and charts, big stacks of paperwork. That was my job as a kid. I used to go in and file all the papers to be able to get flight lessons out of people. Falcon Foundation, I was brought into a lobby group in 2015, 2016 as a technical consultant. I worked with 5 other lobbyists, and we went and spoke to all the energy sector people. When I went around and spoke to drones to people, here's the thing they told me. They said, we don't really know or care how to use these things. We just don't want them anywhere near our facilities. And it should have dawned on me then to get involved in counter drones, but it took me a little while longer. And then we did a briefing on the Hill for STEM. This was during the Obama era. I doubt I could hold that same briefing today. Education, we're slowly slipping away. And then we created the coalition. And the coalition, I feel it's very important to keep these things safe. Drones shouldn't be flying every place. That's mostly what you have conversations about, is all these illegal operators and rogue drone pilots and people doing crazy stuff. In 2014, a guy told me there was a guy flying up and down 95, going under underpasses and stuff between cars in Washington. I didn't even think of the security violations and flying close to the White House and everything. The guy had actually crashed on the White House lawn. I know the guy. We were sitting in a national press club, and this general gave him an idea. He said, if you with your security clearance, if you went over there and something happened, I doubt you'd get in much trouble. A week later, a guy was drunk and was like, yeah, let's go for it. And he flew over there and crashed, and look what all changed from just that one event. And he crashed on a White House lawn, and then counter drones was kicked off. All these big studies, Pentagon, people flying over the Pentagon, people flying over the White House. And then with Falcon Foundation, we just gained 1 of 11 at the time. I heard there's another one, from 22,000 applicants for beyond visual line of sight. And I'll tell you, it wasn't nothing more than a phone call I made. That's the kind of influence I have. It took me 10 days to get that for someone. Next up, UTM. That's my next big endeavor. I'm here to demystify all this trash equipment and just terrible marketing that I see, that most of this industry is filled with fluff. I got this from an AIA publication in 1975, and if you'll look, guess what? What are they doing here? Package delivery, FPV, they're basically autonomous. This is UTM in 1975. Guess what, people? We still got the same problem. That's not going to be solved. NASA's working on it. I was just at Ames yesterday speaking to the guy that's working the whole thing. It's not going to be solved anytime soon because here's the problem. Command and control links. My grandfather was a captain during Operation Aphrodite in 1944 when they were flying remote-controlled bombers into Germany. It was using B-17s at the time, and it was not successful in the least. They didn't hit any of their targets. You know why? Command and control. They don't have good command and control. If you can't control a vehicle and you lose a signal, then what's going to happen? These people want to ride on 5G. Your cell phone's not going to work, when you go behind a hill. So why would you expect a drone to work? It's not magic, people. This is science. Relay stations. When you fire up one of these DJIs and it shows you the satellites, those are not satellites, people. Those are towers on the ground. It tells you a satellite, and it's not. These are relay stations. The satellite, if you're going to use a satellite, starts from the sky and goes down to a relay station that broadcasts the signal. Very rarely do you have something other than like iridium bands that actually uses a satellite signal. Satellites are expensive. I know that the FAA is changing all the airline equipment to satellite-based approaches, and that's what we're going to be using. We're not going to be using this ASB and stuff that they speak about. And then onboard equipment, what kind of equipment are we going to have on these vehicles? It can't be too heavy, it can't be too power constrained because the performance, you're going to lose a lot of that. And then traffic management. The flight procedures that I have designed and I have standards for is much like flying IFR, and it's been organized for efficiency and safety. But we still got the same problems we had in 1944 with Operation Aphrodite and in 1975, command and control. Now we're going to get into CUAS coalition. I've always felt, and this is my philosophy, through better CUAS equipment, we can worry about the regulations less because the equipment takes care of these rogue drone problems. And we've been on Capitol Hill 70 times, and I found out it's over 23 different federal laws that we have to change. And so that makes Congress and the legislators nervous. They've never seen anything like this. For one action, we got to change 23 federal laws. So everyone agrees. We go into an office, we speak with the people, and they say, this is great, but what are we going to do about changing the law? Because I just can't blanket sign off on some of this stuff. It's got to pass in the House 4 committees and 3 in the Senate. You would pat yourself on the back if you passed just one committee on one side of the hill. Much less, 7 committees have got to say yes to this. Now to the equipment. The equipment is either military grade, and it's going to be expensive, or it's garage grade, not very good. These startup companies promise you a whole lot. The ones that's been signed on by the military even have bamboozled some of the military people. Most of the stuff doesn't work, people. We need new equipment and real people to design this stuff, or we're not going to have any protections. So the asset owners' hands are tied. And, I sat in a meeting DHS with Allison here, and we had all the asset owners on one side of the room and all the federal people on the other side of the room. And the asset owners were like, please help us out. We don't know what to do. And all the federal people were like, well, we got all these laws. And, they just want to basically sit back and do nothing. So I've seen the drone violations that were reported by the FAA. In 2015, you'd get about 1 a month. 2016, 10 a month, 17, 100. Now it's up to 1,000, over 1,000 reports of incidents where pilots had to either change direction, or they felt it was too close, or there was a person flying at an airport that was reported. So the only thing that's going to change all this stuff, major terrorist attack. And I hate to say that, but that's the only way we're probably going to move forward. But I'm going to keep pegging away because I hope that they'll listen to me so that we can get out in front of this problem. Now, I'm certain some people have either some comments or some questions.
How long can we expect before the laws get changed that will allow IP attacks of drone drones?
So IP, that would be cybercrime? Is that what you mean?
Right. So there are different ways of attacking drone drones. There's a kinetic kill method. There's other methods that are put forth by companies like Market 13 or Defend in Israel, where the internet packets, the command and control and telemetry are intercepted, and then a rogue packet is inserted, which causes the drone to do something.
That's correct.
So there are laws, namely the Telecommunications Act of drone is another person's computer system, even though the drone may be flown by a quote-unquote bad guy. How long can we expect before there are exceptions to the 1934 laws that allow us to mess with somebody else's drone?
So in some of the standards that I developed that Patrick pushed me to create, we have two different categories. One's a soft kill mitigation, and what you're speaking about would be a soft kill mitigation. The hard kill stuff is going to be ran through DHS, and it's going to be an extremely difficult license to get because you're shooting a projectile. You could be using ballistics, you could be using nets, things of that nature that, if a drone's coming down over a crowd, that's going to be bad if we shot it out of the sky and debris are falling. Now, back to your thing, if we did develop something, we still have the whole control of an aircraft taking over, and then they kind of want to bundle this thing in a suite and have it all done at once. If we start to nitpick each one of the laws, then we're going to have a big liability issue with the insurance people. And so we really don't bring up the liability portion of this because, if the ambulance chasers start coming after us, it could go south before we even get any of the laws changed. If we did do that, that's a good idea to split it up. So what I had originally proposed was that the FCC would have a soft kill mitigation license and that DHS would have the hard kill. And so that gives the FCC a stake in the game because I feel they're behind on enforcement and things of that nature. And it gives DHS the ability to be able to defend against people into prisons and other places that we're going to have to possibly use the hard kill stuff because we don't know what kind of terrorist event is coming. In my latest article I put out, you give someone about a minute before they know if it's going to be a threat or not until the threat has happened. That's not a lot of time. And then you start to think, how am I going to know if it's a threat? I got to look at the payload. That's going to be difficult. And then I was just told too that SWAT teams now have trained that anytime a drone goes down into a crowd, you should treat it that there's explosives on board internally that we won't be able to see. So if a drone was to come into an NFL game or a baseball game or something like that and it actually interferes with the game, I guarantee you it's going to be pandemonium because these people are going to just take off. And there was an incident here in December. The guy was flying and dropping pamphlets at both of the stadiums right here. No one even saw it happen because the guy missed his target. But if a drone comes down on a field and they stop the game, it's going to be pandemonium.
Like a lot of other things with this technology. I mean, I know I've talked to people, I've been interviewed by GAO and other government organizations, and they talk about magic bullets and stuff, but I'm not seeing an investment in the technology and research. Is this coming, or are we just waiting for the budgets to go? Is there going to be money for this?
It's tough to say. Okay, so I was down at SoftWorks in Tampa. That's for the Special Operations Forces, and we spoke with all the warfighters down there, and they have a completely different way of looking at this stuff. They just take equipment and send it downrange and see how it performs. Most of the stuff didn't perform very well unless it was military grade. They had a lot of problems with the garage stuff, so now they're really hesitant to use any more equipment like that because they feel it's just marketing fluff. I went just recently and spoke at a government defense contractors symposium. And when I did my whole counter drone thing, they all kind of laughed at me that they're using lasers now and they don't know what to do for the homeland. And they said that they think it's all smoke and mirrors and none of this equipment works because they've gone out and tried to test some of this equipment and it doesn't perform in the least. For instance, this company D-Drone, I know everyone's hot about that. In my assessment, they don't even get 1 point in situational awareness, much less 1 point in any of the mitigation stuff that they promise. And situational awareness, that's how you figure out if it's a threat or not. With their equipment, you can just go ahead and ban everyone. But what happens when you ban someone and they didn't need to be banned and you wreck their investment? Then you're going to have the liability and the insurance people, the ambulance chasers coming after you. So it's only going to take 2 or 3 events like that, and people will be hesitant to use the equipment. Mike.
First of all, just mentioned D-Drone. I think it's interesting. I just read an article that they partnered with the DoD. So
another company that's been hoodwinked. Yes, sir.
Second thing is kind of piggyback on what Jeff was talking about. I've talked to a bunch of these companies, and they talk about protocol manipulation.
Sure.
Get around this jamming or hacking rule. What is from internally from a rules perspective? What's the viewpoint on this protocol manipulation, and is it legal to do in order to mitigate?
Okay, so protocol manipulation, I call it RC mixing or protocol mixing. And basically what it is, if you're familiar with networking, you send out a packet, and the first packet is coded with a message that says no longer speak to the controller you're speaking to and speak to a new controller. The new controller is the sUAS equipment. The company I work with is a member of our coalition, Department 13. They have their equipment indemnified as a non-jammer. So that's important. If your company's not indemnified and you're going through the process, it's going to be very, very difficult. I think they use some very skillful words in that to get it to go through, and I don't think they're going to allow any more companies to get through that. But you're still taking over the aircraft, and so that's another federal law you're breaking. You're always breaking these federal laws with this stuff. Until we get all the laws changed, it'll still be illegal. Other companies that are using the protocol mixing or manipulation, some of them are just doing a replay attack. That's not really anything skillful, and it is still jamming. So I doubt they will get their equipment indemnified as a non-jammer because it's just a replay attack and can affect other systems. It's not like Department 13s, they specifically identify the drone and then put the packet out there, and then the only thing that it would affect is that drone. Jammer affects everything. It's I try to say it's like, their equipment is like using a squirt gun to put out a birthday candle, and using a jammer is like a water hose or a fireman's hose. And it goes down range. Jammers are a real big problem. The FCC is never going to allow a jammer, ever, because it goes against their mantra of keeping a signal clean and not impeding upon other people's frequencies. We were speaking earlier about the auctioning off of the frequency bands. What happens if you're impeding on someone else's property? That's trespass, right? They're not going to allow you to ever do that. Any other questions? All right. Thanks a lot.